Welcome to the Manifestation Lab. This is your host, Kelly Howe. From the grounded science to the mystical and unseen, we're investigating this big experiment we call life and finding what really works when it comes to manifesting a life that sets your heart and your soul on fire. Welcome to the lab. Hey, welcome back to the Manifestation Lab. Really looking forward to today's conversation. I got to sit down with Dr. Jeff Tarrant again about a month ago and start talking about his latest projects. Now, I had Jeff on the podcast about a year ago. Jeff is the owner-founder of the Neuromeditation Institute, and we really leaned into the science behind meditation. We talked about the 4 styles of meditation, his courses that you can take, of course, for specific issues that you're working through, specific struggles, and what meditation style might be right for you. And this time we're talking about something completely different. Jeff has an upcoming book called Becoming Psychic: Lessons from the Minds of Mediums, Healers, and Psychics. Of course, that's right up my alley. So as soon as I talked to Jeff last time, the second we got off of our call, I thought, you know what, I've got to have him back on to talk about the more spiritual side. Not that meditation isn't spiritual, but there's just so much more beyond that I knew that I wanted to talk to him about. And then lo and behold, I start seeing him posting about his upcoming courses and workshops that he's doing, all about developing psychic abilities and the research and science behind how to make that happen. So exciting. Jeff's book can be pre-ordered at Barnes & Noble, Simon & Schuster, and Books A Million. I know I'm going to pre-order that as soon as I get done recording this introduction. If this piques your interest, you can enjoy a free guided meditation of Dr. Tarrant's at www.psychicmindscience.com. I actually went through this meditation. I think it's only about 10 minutes long. Really good. And like I said, it's free. Why not check it out? Really helps to open up and get into that right brain and open up, as he says, more spacious aspects of the mind and really get into the higher self and that higher intuition. Really great meditation. I definitely recommend checking that out. So again, you can find Jeff at psychicmindscience.com for courses and workshops specifically on developing intuition and psychic abilities. And then if you're interested in checking out the Neuromeditation Institute, you can find that at neuromeditationinstitute.com. And here's Dr. Jeff Tarrant. I knew as soon as we talked last time that I would want to have you back on because I had you on, probably a year ago. I think it was episode like 2 or 3, like early. And we had a great conversation, but I knew as soon as we stopped talking that I wanted to have you back on to talk more about your spiritual side and all of the research that you do and the things that you're learning about our psychic connections and our intuitive abilities and all that. It's just super exciting. I know that my listeners, like that's their jam. Every time I talk to an intuitive or a psychic or anything, even in that department, it's always one of my most listened to episodes. So they are going to love this. Cool. So maybe I'm like, there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but where I want to start is going back to, I was thinking about when you still lived in town here in Columbia. I know that that's when you were starting to do brain scans on intuitives. And so maybe talk to me, like, how did you even start doing that? How did that evolve?
It was not something that I was looking for, which is kind of a funny thing about this work, right? Like a lot of times things just happen and, or things fall in your lap in a way that, it's like, oh, okay, I guess that's what I'm supposed to be doing now. But I was actually working at the University of Missouri. And, I had a student that was working for me in my lab, and he worked for me for a year doing biofeedback stuff. And, it was great. And then at the end of the year, he was graduating. And so we had a goodbye dinner for him. And so this may be the last time I ever see him. And he says, so I want to tell you about my mom. Okay. And he was acting weird. And, it was like, I was like, what's going on? Proceeds to tell me about his mom, who lives in St. Louis, who, after a holotropic breathwork experience, started spontaneously channeling shamanic tribal languages,
Whoa.
uh, and that after that experience, like, and after some time, has been able to control this ability, can kind of turn it on, turn it off. And so anyway, this student of mine tells me about this and is basically like, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Do you want to map her brain? I'm like, yeah, duh.
Yes, I do actually.
Right.
And so was this part of I'm assuming it was, but was this part of your belief system already at this time, or were you kind of still figuring that out?
I've had a sort of complicated belief system, right? Because it's like, it's not, I sort of fall on both sides of things. I believe in all kinds of weird things, and I've had a lot of weird experiences, and I'm also kind of skeptical. And, I've got enough scientific training that I don't believe everything I see. And so it's a weird combo. It's like, I really resonate with the X-Files poster, that Mulder had in the back. I want to believe. I really want to believe. I really want this stuff to be true. And I've got this part of my brain that questions and, wants to sort of like prove it. And so I think that's where my work has kind of come in, right? Is at that intersection of like, and now I've seen enough things that I know this is true. I've seen things that there's no way to account for except that it's real. And, but, I still want to understand it. And so, this is kind of, I think that's kind of where my work has kind of picked up.
So I can relate to so much of that. My brain is the same. I'm not obviously out there doing the research like you are, but I have these like really distant poles of like, I can go totally into the woo woo. Like my listeners are used to me talking about that. And I do have this part of me that's like very stubborn and needs to know, like, how is this working? Is this real? So I can totally relate to that. So you've been there for a while, like dancing with these two sides of you. This woman, the son shows up and he's like, can we scan my mom's brain? How long had she been channeling at this point when he brought this to you?
I want to say 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
And, but it took her a long time to even figure out if she was actually saying anything or if it was just gibberish, or she had no idea because she didn't know what she was saying. And so, she'd never studied any other languages. And she finally found somebody that would take her seriously because, of course, you can imagine her sending this to a bunch of professors and going like, hey, what is this? They pretty much were like, yeah, you're crazy.
Get on some meds.
Yeah, right. Or, this is glossolalia, sort of speaking in tongues kind of a thing. And it's like, and she finally found an anthropologist who recognized something in the languages. The anthropologist happened to be from South America, and then was able to connect it to these specific tribes. There's actually more than one tribal dialect. And so then she got some of the stuff translated, before, as fate would have it, right, this anthropologist died, kind of midway through their work together. But she managed to get some of the stuff translated, and so again, kind of providing some validation, right? That it's like, oh, okay, like.
I bet that was such a relief for her.
Yeah, I think it was, right? There's like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy and there is something going on here. And, and so, yeah, for me, that was, honestly, when I first kind of stepped into it, it was more curiosity. Because again, I've done enough weird things that's kind of like, I assume that half or more of it is just whatever. But it's, it's still fun. And, I'm willing to kind of like play in that space a little bit. And so I wasn't really expecting much, but then when I met her and, we worked together for like 2 years, like very consistently. And so, got to know her really well. And And then she's the one that kind of introduced me to a wider world of mediums and psychics and things out there that I was able to work with over the next, several years after that.
So what did that look like when you started scanning her? Did you just, look at her overall, or did you have her, start looking at what it looked like when she wasn't in trance versus when she was? How did you start to work with that?
Yeah, and interestingly, like she actually doesn't even go into a trance.
Oh, wow.
It's really interesting. She just can like be like, "Oh, okay, are you ready?" And it's like, "Yeah, I'm ready." And then she'll just start
Wow.
it. She'll just let the languages fly, and then she can like stop and like have a conversation in English, and then turn it back on again. And
Wow.
um, but yeah, I mean, we did so much brain mapping with her. She would come up and visit me sometimes in Columbia. Sometimes I'd go visit her in St. Louis. But some of the brain imaging was just her at baseline, right? Like, so the question is her brain just different than sort of average in general when she's not doing anything? But then also like, well, what's going on in her brain when she is channeling these languages, or when she's doing a mediumship reading, or when she's, we were playing around with all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really my first exposure to this kind of work. And so I was kind of making stuff up as I went along.
Mm-hmm.
I'd try something and scratch my head and go, okay, I didn't do that the best way. Next time we do it, let's do
Right.
it. Let's do it this way. And, luckily she was, willing to kind of keep working with me, and kind of together we kind of figured out what we were doing.
Okay, so fast forward a little bit. She was where it started, and then am I right that you started doing this with a whole group of mediums and intuitives and looking at their brains?
Yeah, so so we presented together at a conference in San Diego shortly after, we started getting this data, and we had some interesting stuff. And so she said, "Hey, let's go present this at this conference." It was put on by a group called the Forever Family Foundation, FFF, and it's a group based in New York that their primary function is to connect bereaved parents with evidential mediums who have kind of
Mm-hmm.
proven that they know what they're doing. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of their purpose. And Janet, the woman I'd been working with, was connected with them, and they put on this annual conference. Let's go present here. Great. So we went to San Diego and presented there, which then introduced me to a whole new world. I'd never been to anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And got to meet a lot of people. And then the founder of the Forever Family Foundation, his name's Bob Ginsberg, connected with him, and he said, "Hey, look, why don't you come out to my place in New York? We'll invite a bunch of the mediums out. We'll make a weekend out of it." And so we did that twice, actually. I flew out there, and he invited a bunch of mediums out. And
Fun.
we would just, we would, I'd run tests on people all day long. One night we had a spoon bending party.
Oh
And
my gosh, how
yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So what did you start seeing? What does this look like? And when you say scanning, are you doing QEEGs, or what are you doing?
Yeah, so it's a quantitative EEG. And so basically we're doing a 19 channel measurement of the electrical activity in the brain. And, with some of the software, the ways we can analyze that, first off, it can translate all that information into numbers. That's the quantitative part, which is really helpful, because then if I have a number at baseline and I have a number when somebody's doing a mediumship reading, I can compare the two and say, oh, this certain brainwave increased 75% or whatever, right? Because I've got numbers. So I'm not just looking at squiggly lines.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we can put those numbers on little heat maps. So you get these little 3D, we call them brain maps, because that's what they are, right? It's like a little head map with a little color coding showing where the activity is for the different brain waves. And so, this is kind of the work I've been doing for a long time. So the advantage of using something like this is it's very portable. I can bring my whole system with me in my backpack anywhere, as opposed to something like an fMRI or
Yeah.
something like that, right? Where it costs a fortune and it's very awkward, and this is easy. So what we kind of found, we found a lot of things, right? Because I guess that's one finding, is that not everybody does the exact same thing, which kind of makes sense. Why would we expect everybody's brain to look exactly the same when they do a psychic reading? Like, that doesn't even make sense. But there are patterns, particularly related to brain regions. So not so much brain wave activity, because that's one of those areas where people are very individual, in terms of one person might increase slow brain waves in a certain area, and another person might increase fast brain waves in that area. And so they're both modifying the function of that region of the brain, but they're doing it differently.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So which areas of the brain do you see start to change when people shift into these states?
There's a few. I think the easiest, if that's the right word, way to look at the findings is kind of in a left versus right hemisphere kind of a way. And, even though when I say that, it's not going to be a big shock to anybody, I was actually sort of surprised. I wasn't really expecting that. And it actually took me a while to kind of recognize that it's like, oh God, this is like right side, right side, right side, right side. Like the right side just keeps showing up as changing more dramatically than the left side.
Interesting. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask about it. I keep hearing, so it seems like I keep tripping across information that people are starting to say, oh, there's not anything to this right brain, left brain thing. But then the more I learn about intuitives, the more I know. I haven't looked at my brain, but it's like, it does make sense to me that when I'm in a very creative, intuitive state, I'm not in that like linear left brain thinking. So I'm confused by that, because it feels like in my personal experience and like with people I work with, it feels very, very true. But then I keep seeing people say, oh, that's been discounted. So what's the story with that?
Well, both are true to some degree, right? So I think there's been kind of a counter reactivity to the whole left brain, right brain thing, because it's the way that we usually talk about it is oversimplified and, exaggerated, right? It's like, women are from Venus and men are from Mars, right? Like it's like this way oversimplified way of kind of thinking about it. So then, of course, there's somebody who's going to go like, well, that's not really the way it is. And there's a lot of functions between the left and the right side that are redundant and they do the same things, and it's not, so, and that's true. And for 85 to 90% of the population, the left brain is where the vast majority of the language processing happens. It happens in the left hemisphere and not the right. It's very distinct. And nobody's going to argue with that. You can look up certain regions of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are both language centers. So language expression and language reception are on the left side. They don't exist on the right side. So what's interesting is that I think one of the key findings is that in order to really tune into more subtle information, whether it's a spirit guide or whether it's, talking to a discarnate entity or picking up on psychic information or even just intuition, we don't have to go that far. Just say intuitively tuning in, there has to be some level of quieting down your internal talk. If you're talking to yourself, if you're thinking and analyzing and judging, and those are almost all word-based processes. That's the way we think, is we think in words. And so it doesn't matter if you're saying the words out loud or if they're just in your head. It's still a left brain process.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of the time we're worrying or brooding or planning, or we're using words, we're thinking in words. Um, and so what we know is that when the left brain is activated, it actually inhibits functioning on the right side.
Mm.
And so when you're caught up in language, you can't access the right hemisphere.
Interesting.
So I think what happens with a lot of people is that who are really tapped in, or tap in more easily, I should say, because I think we're all tapped in, right? But people who it's more natural for them, right? I think what they've gotten good at is very quickly going back and forth, because they can talk about what their experience is, right? They're using words, but I think they're not necessarily getting into analysis. And in fact, when you watch mediums or psychics, a lot of times they talk really fast,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what they're doing is they're trying to not to get caught into interpreting or analyzing. It's just whatever comes through. Whoa, excuse me.
Woo!
Got excited, knocked my glasses right off my face.
It excites me too.
Oh my gosh. But I think what they're doing is just letting whatever information they're getting just come through without filtering it. Because as
Just
soon as you
letting it
start,
go.
yeah, because as soon as you start to filter it, now you're interpreting and analyzing and questioning, and which then you're in that left brain. So I think they've figured out clever ways to be able to kind of be in the left brain, but still access language.
Okay. So overall, the left brain is where language happens, like actual words. And then it's, from what I understand, it's very sequential. Is that right? Like this is where we make sense of what comes first and what comes later. And then the right brain, maybe go ahead and describe what that is more so.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. The left brain is, but again, that's even related to language. Like as soon as we start using language, we start limiting our experience,
Mm-hmm.
because now we're taking what's really happening and we're translating it. And as soon as we translate something, we've changed it. And so it's not the actual experience of something. It's at least one step removed, sometimes two or three or four steps removed. So the right side is more of like an experience, like a pure experience. So when people are truly in a mindful state, where you're just experiencing what's happening in the moment without judgment, without analysis, that's a right brain process. So this is one of the areas where I feel like the work that I've done with meditation starts to flow into this, is that it's like, well, there are meditation strategies that you can use that help exercise these functions in the brain, so that if you're trying to, uncover your own skills, you can actually use meditation to help you do that.
Yeah, that's so cool. So maybe this is a great place to segue into your recently released psychic development course that you're doing. So what is that? Well, first, let me ask this. Can anybody do that course? Like, even if someone feels like they are not tapped in, they feel like they have none of that connection, will this course be right for them? Or I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it depends. So the course, what we've started doing, let me take one step back, because we talked about this left right brain thing. There's some other brain regions that have consistently shown up, right? And that we sort of see as being consistently relevant to this work. So what we've done is then we've kind of extrapolated from that and said, well, gosh, can we use some neuromodulation, neurostimulation technologies to kind of impact those areas of the brain? Even the left right brain thing, like there's technologies we can use to kind of shut down the left side and stimulate the right side at the same time. And so what we've done in this psychic exploration class is, as part of the class, you get one of these pieces of equipment that you sort of buy. It's the audio visual entrainment glasses. It's kind of part of the cost. And so we ship them out to people or whatever. And then each week in the class, what we're doing is talking about some of the research and talking about some case studies, explaining what's going on in the brain here, and then introducing a specific way to use the technology to influence that, right? So there's 4 weeks, and each week we're kind of doing something a little bit different. And so then people get to experiment with it, right? So they own the glasses now. So, we do it together so we can kind of, make sure everybody knows what they're doing and process as a group. But then for the next week, it's like people practice, right? So they start using that technology and use it along with their practice of whatever they're doing, if it's spirit communication or whatever. And then the next week we can check in, right? And go like, so how was that? And kind of hear from people like what worked, what didn't. And so what we're seeing is that not every different approach is going to work with every person, right? Like some people are like, ooh, I don't really like that one. And other people are like, oh my God, that was amazing. It was like a direct line to the other side. It was like, okay. And so I think having a few different approaches, which is kind of what we do, then everybody can kind of find what's going to work for them. The other part, which connects to what you said, can anybody do this? What we have witnessed so far is that if somebody is already semi-tapped in, they're used to paying attention to their intuition, and they're used to, maybe they have some sort of communication with their guides or whatever. Those people usually respond very quickly. It's almost like you're exaggerating what their brain is already doing. It's like the brain's already doing this, and then the technology kind of like adds energy to it.
Just dials it up a little bit.
So you can see where if people aren't necessarily tapped in, it's like, well, if we're exaggerating the patterns that already exist, it's like, well, if the patterns don't exist, what are you exaggerating, right? So
I see.
So it's not as consistent for people who maybe are kind of just starting out, in this area. And I say inconsistent because there have been people that have had pretty cool experiences, and it seems to kind of open things up. But, you just don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask because I know somebody's going to be out there thinking that. Well, I don't feel connected at all. I wouldn't think there'd be that many of those people listening to my podcast. Right. And at the same time, you probably don't get that many people that show up, I would imagine, to do that class if they have no connection. But
right, it's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I would think so. So let's go back just a little bit again, because we talked about the right and left brains. What are are there other specific regions of the brain that we're really trying to dial up?
Yeah, there's, so the one that I think is probably the most interesting is, it's on the right side, big shock. And it's, you'll hear it referred to in different ways, but usually it's kind of like the right parietal lobe. Sometimes you'll hear it called the temporal parietal junction, right? Because the temporal lobe is kind of on the side of your head by your ears. And then the parietal lobe is right behind that, kind of the back quadrant of your brain. Mm-hmm. So temporal parietal junction, it's kind of where those guys run into each other, those two parts of the brain. But that part of the brain, that region, it's not, because it's not really one thing, it's more of a region, seems to be important for boundaries. And so when it is doing its normal job, normal in air quotes, mm-hmm. Then our perception is that we are individual little people running around in our meat suits. And I'm Jeff, I have an identity, and I'm separate from Kelly, who's way over there. And so that's kind of the normal functioning. But then if you disrupt that area of the brain, all of a sudden, people seem to have an easier job of being empathic, perspective taking. It's like, oh, maybe I can see outside of my small ego, and maybe I can connect to other people. But it goes beyond that, because when you disrupt that part of the brain, people also report more spiritual experiences. which I think is connecting to something bigger than yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's the same process. It's just, what are you connecting to? And so it's interesting. So Janet with the shamanic stuff, she had a major disruption in this area when she's doing her thing. Most of the mediums that I've looked at, when they're doing their thing, there's some sort of disruption in this area.
And it can go either way. It could either, be more active or less active.
It's usually less active.
Oh, okay.
It's usually a bunch of slow activity. So delta or theta waves increase dramatically in those areas where, I mean, there have been numerous times where I've seen the activity and I'm like, this looks wrong. Like, this looks like something's wrong with my equipment, or because it's so big that it's like, oh, I must have a bad signal or something. And it's like
you can't miss it.
Oh no,
it's such a huge shift.
It's crazy huge, right? And it's like it looks like something's broke, right? Because
wow.
like, yeah, this shouldn't look like this. And and somehow I think that's the way that they have some sort of way of getting that system offline so that they can do their work. And I think some people they just can naturally do that. They can just kind of shift out of that. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting actually, because some of the work with that part of the brain came nowhere. It didn't come out of working with psychics and mediums. It actually came from a health psychologist from the University of Missouri.
Oh, really?
Yep. His name's Brick Johnstone. And he's been there forever at MU and does research with traumatic brain injuries. And so he did this work. He's published 2 different studies that I know of, maybe more, looking at people that had injuries to that region of the brain. And so again, you're disrupting the normal function, right? And what he found was that those people became more empathic and more spiritual after the injury. And so started looking at that. And so some of the listeners and you too may remember years ago, this buzz about the God spot in the brain, and that's what this is. Oh, wow. The God spot. And, of course, Brick hated that because he never called it the God spot. He's a researcher, but the media got a hold of it. And,
Yes, I do remember that. That's funny. So I was going to ask if somebody didn't know that this person was a medium and they scan their brain, would they look at it and go, oh my gosh, you have a traumatic brain injury? And I think you just answered my question. They might wonder.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there is an analysis I can run in one of my systems that predicts if a person has a traumatic brain injury. So it's called a discriminant analysis. It's just a statistical way of taking a bunch of data and kind of predicting something. And what's interesting is that when I run these mediums through that, very frequently it triggers it and says, there's a 85% chance or a 92% chance or whatever.
Oh my gosh.
And so, and whether they've had a brain injury or not, they're what it tells me is that their brain is functioning significantly differently than what we would expect, right? Than sort of
outside of the norm.
Right. Yeah. Right. Enough that it's triggering this, right?
That's fascinating. So what was that guy's name? Brick Johnstone?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to have to look him up now. I'm going to have to look at that. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about these goggles. What are they doing
yeah.
to help stimulate these parts of the brain?
Right. So, the particular technique is called audiovisual entrainment. Back in the day, it used to be called light and sound stimulation. It's the same thing. But so there's these glasses that you wear, and they've got lights built into the eye set. So there's kind of 4 lights, kind of in the shape of a square, that are in the eye set. And typically you wear these glasses with your eyes closed. And the lights will, they plug into either your computer or a standalone box, depending on what kind of system you have. And So you pick a program, you're telling it what to do, and the lights will flicker on and off at the designated frequency, right? So for example, the way that we understand brain waves is by how many repetitions there are of a wave in a second of time. So it's the speed of the brain wave. So delta are slow brain waves, right? So there's only 2 or 3 repetitions of the wave within a second of time. Fast brain waves like gamma, there's like 40 repetitions in a second. So it's very fast. So it's going on and off, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down rapidly. Your brain makes all of these frequencies and everything in between. But what's interesting is that those frequencies, it's cycles per second. And so if you flash lights in the eyes, even with the eyes closed, a certain number of times each second, on and off, so let's say 10 times a second, the lights are going on and off 10 times a second, your brain starts matching that pattern. So that's the entrainment, right? So we can entrain the brain to a certain frequency. So if I want to get into a theta state, right, which is often associated with healing and the subconscious and intuition, well, we could run a program at 8 cycles per second or kind of in that range, right? So it's going to kind of bring your brain down into that level. And then, of course, we can also change the color of the glasses of the light. So we can make it any color that we want. So you got to, so there's another layer to it, right? And I think this is what is really cool, because of the way visual processing works, each eyeball is kind of split in half. And the left side of your eyeball sends information to the right part of your brain. The right part of your eyeballs go to the left side of your brain. So literally, because you've got these 4 lights in a square, you can send one signal to the right hemisphere and a different signal to the left hemisphere. You can even do different colors.
Wow.
One color to the left hemisphere and one color to the right hemisphere.
Oh, I could see why you're having a ball playing with this.
So we can use this to kind of encourage the brain into different states. There's another technique that isn't even stimulate. Well, it is stimulation, but it's different. It's called Ganzfeld. And it's a German word that means whole field. And the old school Ganzfeld technique was you would take a ping pong ball, cut it in half, tape it over your eyeballs, and then shine like a red light on your face. It's like, okay, well, there's a Ganzfeld setting on the glasses. You just set it on Ganzfeld, put the glasses on, done. So it's just kind of holding this color. It's not flickering or anything. But when you use that in combination with something like listening to white noise, what happens is the brain seems to become overloaded with sensory information that doesn't make any sense. There's nothing there to process. So you got this constant light and you got this noise, which noise is really just a whole bunch of frequencies randomly thrown in there. So your brain kind of can't make sense out of it. So it kind of gives up, which then opens your mind up to some other options as well.
How fascinating.
So there's all these little tricks, right? To kind of, use tech to kind of get the brain out of the way.
Yeah. Okay. So now I need to know about your personal experiences with this. Are you noticing that your intuition, that your connection is strengthening? I can't imagine that it isn't. You're already such a spiritual guy.
I would say in general, yes. But one of the things I've noticed for myself is, and I've had other people notice this as well, that if I'm using some of the tech, whether it's the glasses or something else, like while I'm using it, it doesn't always, there's not, a light show and rainbows and unicorns and stuff. It's, sometimes it's just I know. Sometimes it's just like, oh, okay, that was nice, right? And it's like a little disappointing because it's like, well, all right, um, nothing interesting happened. But then later that day or the next day, even, it's like, whoa, I'm
Oh,
like,
cool.
I'm like super tapped in. What's going on? And it took me a minute to recognize there was a connection because there was sometimes such a big time difference. You wouldn't necessarily connect the dots that it's like something you did yesterday is affecting how you feel in the morning. Uh, and so, I noticed that for myself. And then I've had a few students in these classes report similar things that it's like, oh, when I'm wearing them, not much is going on. But then afterwards, I can tune in or whatever. Right. And so,
Yeah. So does that mean that entrainment is holding over time? It's not just like when you're in the goggles and doing the meditation?
I think what happens in some cases is that uh, it's so much information for the brain to have to process with all the sensory stuff or whatever is happening that the brain can't land anywhere. And so it's just kind of like disturbing things, but there's nowhere to go. And so it's almost like we disturb it and then we have to wait for the dust to settle, before we sort of get the benefit of it.
Okay.
And so, why are some people like that and other people experience it in the moment? I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of those variations that we see. And it happens for me. I mean, I have had experiences where I could tap in better during using the glasses. One was like sort of a remote viewing kind of a thing. Um, and then another one was where I had this experience. I mean, this is kind of a fun one. I'll share this one real quick.
Yeah.
This is actually a while ago, before I knew a lot of what I know now. I was home alone for some reason and was getting ready to go to bed. And so I was like, oh, I'll put the glasses on while I'm laying in bed, put them on a theta program and, just see what happens. So I was laying in bed and had the theta thing on. Nobody was home. I was home alone. Uh, live in a safe neighborhood. I've never had any problems, and had the strongest feeling I've ever had that somebody was standing right there staring at me. And it was like, I'm going, dude, this is just your mind. Nothing's going on. Don't worry about it. And I had to take the glasses off. Like it was so strong. I was like, okay. And I took the glasses off.
There has to be a person there.
There has to be a person there. Now, there may have been something there, took the glasses off, of course, didn't see anything and was like, geez, man, God. I was like, such a strong feeling. I was like, okay, okay. Put the glasses back on. A few more minutes later, like same thing. I was like, so I was like, okay, I'm done. It's like kind of freaking me out a little bit, but because I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't looking for that. You know, so there are some weird things that can happen.
Yeah. You start tuning in, you'll tune into all kinds of strange things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I have to backtrack because I keep forgetting to ask this question, or it's not really even a question as much as I've noticed a pattern, and I'm just so curious what you think of this. But, I have a lot of contact with psychics and mediums as well, and people with varying levels of intuition. And I really see a pattern. And I've asked some of my medium friends about this and if they've noticed this too. And they've said yes, that there is such a strong tendency for intuitives to be on the ADD side. And when I look at the symptoms, right, being disorganized, difficulty staying on task, lack of focus, being forgetful, not paying attention to details, that kind of thing, that to me sounds very right brain, like expansive, not necessarily in that linear form left brain. So I just keep wondering how many people struggling with ADD, of course, I know this is a layered concept, but I'm just wondering specifically for kids, like how many of them are really like extrasensory picking up on other things tuned in somewhere else, and we're labeling it as this like flaw. Does that track at all?
Yeah, I've got a lot to say there. So I'll try to sort of
I want to hear it all, honestly, because I think about this a lot. I mean, I'm just like sit back and I see these patterns and I'm like, okay, what is going on here?
Yeah. So the stereotypical brainwave pattern associated with ADHD is excessive theta. Theta is a slow brainwave. And for most people, if they've never heard that before, that sounds counterintuitive. It's like, wait a minute, too slow? Aren't they moving too fast? And it's like, well, you have to kind of flip it around in your brain for a minute, right? Because if there's too much slow brainwave activity, what that essentially means is that those areas of the brain are not doing their job as effectively or as efficiently as they could be. And, so where does this normally happen? In the frontal lobes. Right. So if the frontal lobes are not able to do their job as effectively or as efficiently as possible, then what's that going to look like? Right. It's like, well, what do the frontal lobes do? Well, their biggest job is inhibition. The frontal lobes, that's the primary thing that the frontal lobes do, is stop things. Right. So inhibit your emotions, inhibit impulses. Right. It also inhibiting information. It's like screening information and deciding what you're going to pay attention to and what you're not going to pay attention to, right? So people with ADHD, I don't pay attention very well. Well, it's like, well, based on what, right? So this theta, excessive theta, I think does create a state in which you might be more open to information. And in fact, I see this a lot with mediums and psychics when I look at their brain, is that they have a lot of theta. And so, I don't want to call them ADHD, right? Because that may or may not fit or be fair, but their brain looks like that, right? Where it's like they've got this theta activity. And I think the key there is the disinhibition. They're not as inhibited in what they perceive, what they tune into, right?
Yeah, totally.
The other part that's kind of interesting about this is theta is the dominant brain wave of children. And it starts to shift toward a theta state, or toward an alpha state, sorry, when they're about 8 years old. So if you think about that for a minute, if you think about little kids and how many little kids are naturally intuitive or psychic or talk to spirits or see dead people or whatever. And, and then as their brain starts to speed up out of theta and they start getting taught to think in the left brain way, like we go to school. What are we rewarded for? Language. How well do you express yourself? Right. And everything we do is about expressing, analyzing, dissecting. It's all left brain. Right. So we basically train kids out of access to that information. So if you still have access to that, if you still have some theta cooking around, it may be an indication, right, that it's like it may be easier to tap in, right? Because it's like you've already got that sort of built-in capability.
Yeah. I think I get frustrated because I so many people, and of course I know that it's disruptive. And if you can't fit into the ways that you need to work in your job or in your home life or at school, it's so frustrating. So I'm not trying to discount that. And I can relate to it. Honestly, I was a very slow learner. And as you were talking about that shift that happens around 8, I'm like, I could see totally that that's what happened for me. I think it was a little bit later for me, honestly, because myself and actually all my kids as well, super slow learners when it comes to reading and bringing through that language. And they're all very intuitive. I mean, they're so intuitive. And when you said we're training it out of them, it's like I saw that happening and I'm thinking back to my own life. And it was like, I could see the stages of training that out and getting better and better at language. But I get frustrated because I feel like that when kids are struggling with that, there's no conversation around what might you be sensing that other people aren't. It's all like, this is a problem. This is a flaw. Let's fix it. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of exploration around yes, let's help you get grounded and focused and support your education in this way. But what else might you be experiencing that actually could be super exciting and helpful and creative? It kind of makes me sad, like sad mad, sad mad.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And, and I mean, I think some of that ties into what you were already kind of suggesting, right? Like people who are more creative, who are more artistic, do they tend to be more psychic medium? And it's like, I would say so.
I think so. Yeah.
And so for me, I think the issue is flexibility. Uh, it's like, and that's my own biased perspective, right? Because it's like, well, it's probably useful to fit into society. And it's
Definitely.
probably useful to be able to articulate yourself and your thoughts and your ideas, right? Like that's pretty helpful. But if that's all you can do, if you're sort of stuck over there, then you're very limited, right? And so it's like, can we learn to be flexible enough to kind of shift back and forth if we're kind of using that right brain, left brain thing? Or can I shift into a theta state, but then shift out, like, oh, if I have to balance my checkbook, I probably don't need a bunch of theta cooking around, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can I inhibit that when I need to focus and I need to get on task? But then when I don't need to do that, can I allow that to come forward and, and use that energy?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's being able to flip between the two and use the skill set that on either side. But I see a lot of people running around, I think, with belief systems that their brain is broken or that there's something wrong with me. I have ADD, I have ADHD, and like I said, I totally understand how frustrating that can be. I mean, I'm not like diagnosed, but I definitely can tend towards that. And I very, very much have to daily cultivate like the linear balance and, form and organization. I've always had to work on that. But I just think people are missing, and it's not even dropping into their awareness that they could have a very natural connection to something that might be really enlivening and, help them connect spiritually and just, I don't know, just broaden the scope of their life so much. And they could be right there.
Yeah. It's interesting, I mean, again, kind of that idea that I brought up earlier that, life sometimes puts things in your path that it's like, okay, I wasn't necessarily looking for that, but okay. And since I've started kind of working on this, because, so we were talking about the history of this, and that was, 10 years ago, 11 years ago when I started doing this stuff. And I did it pretty heavily for about 3 or 4 years, moved out here to Oregon, kind of dropped it all. And then it kind of came back very loud about a year ago. Wasn't looking for it. It just sort of happened. Now I'm kind of full back in it again. Anyway, just
Like you can't
recently,
even get away from it. It followed you to Oregon.
it followed me to Oregon. And interestingly, some of the students and clients that have shown up recently have been younger people who have these very atypical experiences, and they don't know what to do with them, and they don't know what they mean, and they can't talk to people about it because they'll want to put them on meds, or they'll judge them, or they'll think they're crazy. And so it's interesting because it's like, I can sort of serve a role with some of these folks of kind of normalizing this and helping them understand what's going on, and like maybe how to, work with that, skillfully, instead of kind of feeling like you don't have any control over it, or, being afraid of it,
Yeah, I love that. Being afraid of it, feeling like you're broken. I see this, like, for a lot of people, there's this gift wrapped inside of this belief that they're flawed. And it's like, the gift is right there, if they just had permission to look into it and lean into it a little bit. So that's helpful because I've been rolling that around in my head for a while, and I'm like, this has to be connected. It absolutely has to be. And so that's super, super, super helpful. So I know you have an event, and I'll let you go here in a few minutes, but coming up with Laura Lynn Jackson. That's
Yeah,
exciting.
it is
Laura, of
exciting.
course, is like a really pretty well-known psychic medium. So tell me
Mhm.
about that class.
So that's a day-long workshop that we're doing in San Diego. And, we're going to be kind of dividing the day up into little sections. And a little bit like I was describing, where I'm going to talk a little bit about certain regions of the brain, some case studies, show some slides and some brain stuff. But then really directing that toward specific meditations or practices that we can do, and we'll do them together as a way to kind of open that part of the brain up or learn how to shift our awareness or whatever it might be. And then Laura will come in and, guide more practices, right? Like experimenting with different remote viewing or psychic stuff or psychokinesis or, various things that we're going to be practicing. So kind of tying it all together. So we have the science and the practice. And of course, I'm sure she'll share some of her own process around how she does this. And, I find her to be very articulate in the way that she is able to, kind of relate, how she does this work in a way that makes it pretty, at least understandable,
She's very relatable.
She is very relatable. Yeah. So this is fun. I'm looking forward to it. It should be a blast.
Yeah, I would love to get out there. I don't think it's going to work with my schedule, but I saw that and I was like, oh, that looks amazing.
Yeah.
Do you think you guys will do it again?
Probably. I mean, we're because this is the first full day workshop we've done together. We're kind of using this to kind of figure out like, oh, okay, well, like, what do we want to do next? And it may turn into something bigger, in terms of like maybe a several day thing or
Yeah.
So we're kind of using this to see what direction we want to go with this next. But yeah, our plans are to do more. We just need to kind of figure it out.
I can see you guys being a dream team because I think people are so hungry for both sides of it, maybe more than ever. I just think people are like, they can't help but notice that they are awakening, that they are more in touch, that these things are real, but they still have that battle going on in their head like we do. So I think you guys are going to be such a beautiful pair for that. How did you meet her? Was she part of this group that you were like, that you went to New York to do the readings on?
She was actually when Janet and I presented at that Forever Family conference, so when I first got started with this, and Janet said, you have to meet a friend of mine, Laura Lynn. You're going to love her. And I was like, okay. And, I didn't know who she was and she hadn't written any of her books yet at that point. And she was at the conference and was doing readings and, she might have presented something. I don't remember. And so she was busy. She was busy the whole conference. Laura was. I mean, I met her and we hung out a couple of times, and then I said, hey, I want to map your brain. Are you down for that? And she was like, yeah, sure. Yeah. But, it was like super busy the whole time and everybody wanted her attention and, and
and you're like, excuse me, I need you to come over here and sit down so I can map your brain.
Yeah. And so literally at the end of the last day, we kind of snuck off and we found a conference room where nobody in and set up all of our stuff and like did it right there in the conference room. And so that was the first time that I got some data with her. And then she showed up for one of the New York trips and she came out there. And so we were able to collect some more data, that time. So
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. And we've just kind of stayed in touch, since, she actually put some of the brainwave data in her first book.
Okay.
In one of the chapters. And so we've kind of stayed connected.
Well, it was a fun synchronicity because she kind of like randomly flew on my radar. I was already aware of her and I love her like for a while I have. But her name actually came up in one of my readings, like right before you guys announced that you were doing that thing. So, and she hadn't been on my radar for a while. So I was like, well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You gotta love it when that happens, right? You can't make that up. It was just too bizarre. When her name came up in my reading, I was like, okay, that's weird. And then that popped up like right after. So I thought, oh, okay, well, there that is. So it's fun. Yeah. It's fun.
Cool. Yeah, it's very fun.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for being here. I mean, I know that all of the listeners are going to absolutely love this. It wouldn't surprise me if some of them end up joining you and Laura Lynn Jackson in, where'd you say it was, San Diego?
San Diego, yeah,
Awesome.
that'd be great.
Yeah. And then I'll have you back on because I do want to ask you about your mushroom tinctures that I see you promoting. I'm so fascinated with mushrooms in general and their ability to help us shift and change and focus and all the things. But I so appreciate you and the work that you're doing because I know my audience is just going to love this so much. And
Oh, good.
hopefully I can get into one of your classes here soon and test out these goggles for myself. So thank you so
Yeah,
much.
that'd be awesome. Thank you.